Hey guys, Level Cap here, and today I have an in-depth review of Battlefield 2042. For anyone unfamiliar with who I am or my relationship to the franchise, I've been a Battlefield-centric content creator for over 10 years. Battlefield games have been some of my favorite games of all time, and the franchise itself is very special to me. And for this review, I will be looking at the big picture aspects of this game, the nuance, and I will be comparing it to past Battlefield games as well. Now, this is going to be a long one, so let's get into it. It's been several weeks since the early access build of 2042 launched. The launch itself was rough, to say the least. Sadly, this is kind of par for the course when it comes to a Battlefield release. Fortunately though, a lot of the rubber banding, server connection, and crash issues have been resolved since then, for me anyway, and so far we've had 2 patches for the game that fixed some major issues, and we have another on the horizon with more promised fixes. Now, I always find Battlefield reviews tricky because as a veteran player, I know the Battlefield experience 3 months from now might be vastly different from what it is today. Heck, Battlefield 5 by the end of its life cycle was a pretty fun experience overall, but during its first 6 months and maybe even a year after launch, it was still riddled with massive problems deeply impacting the user experience. And while there's no denying that Battlefield 2042 has problems right now, I don't feel like they're as fundamental as the ones that Battlefield 5 had at launch. However, only time will tell how easy it is to resolve Battlefield 2042's current issues. One thing I can say for sure is that I am actually really enjoying my time in Battlefield 2042. I know this isn't the case for everyone, and already some of the underlying issues are starting to nag at me more and more with each play session. But I also can't deny that you can do some awesome stuff in this game, and it brings a smile to my face. I'm not rage quitting rounds as I did with Battlefield 5 at launch, and for the most part, I'm enjoying the firefights and gameplay quite a lot. The gunplay, although a little raw in its first pass, feels good and like a return to form for its modern military setting. Now, of course, on launch day, this was not the case, but again, I am happy to report that a lot of the gunplay issues have been fixed already. And now that the weapons are working as intended, there's actually good use for all weapon types, and I find myself swapping between them regularly depending on the situation, which is really important. If there's certain weapon classes that are just poorly balanced at the start and you never use them, well then it vastly cuts down the available weapons that you have to use. Now, sniping in particular is a highlight of this release for me, since the wealth of targets in 128 player servers is extreme, and you can put down some headshots into a seemingly never-ending supply of enemy targets. 2042's massive shift from 64 player servers to 128 players is a fundamental change for the franchise. One that I think could be argued as both a good and bad decision, and honestly I think only time will tell whether or not it was the right choice. So far, I think it's a really fun change, but I do think DICE needs to refine things further to take advantage of their technological accomplishment. It's clear that some maps just play poorly with the massive player count, and many firefights are so chaotic that no amount of skill or experience is going to save you. Enjoying more sniper targets means sniping is better, but it also means that when you swap to playing a class that has to push up and fight in close quarters, well, things get significantly trickier, and DICE's map design just doesn't really seem to understand what the game needs. It's definitely been more rewarding to play in vehicles and snipe than it is to actually try and push up and assault the point with like an assault rifle or machine gun. Constantly getting beat down by overwhelming numbers, lack of cover, and helicopters blowing you up with no warning, it's not always the most pleasant experience. And while that's always at least been some part of the Battlefield experience, well, it seems to actually be doubled in 2042. Kind of like the player count. Funny how that actually works out. Now, visually, the increase in player count is very impressive. I mean, peeking out from behind cover to see literally 20 to 30 enemies at a time with jets flying overhead and tanks pushing forward is both an awesome and terrifying experience. One that may only last a few seconds before you get riddled with bullets. If DICE can actually improve some of the background atmospherics to the levels seen in previous games, I think 2042 could push its all-out warfare feeling to a new plateau of immersion. That being said, the game has quite a few letdowns in the world crafting department, which I will get into later. Now, of course, some maps play better than others. I think the Antarctic Breakaway map is one of my favorites. The opportunities for wingsuit flybys and frozen lake firefights are really epic, and the Discarded map has some truly great oil tanker fights. However, where in previous Battlefield games I could usually avoid the crappy maps using the server browser, Battlefield 2042 only lets me play the base game via their matchmaking system, where I can't deselect maps. I just pick the mode and hit play and have to hope that I'm not playing a map I don't enjoy. And sometimes this results in playing my least favorite map twice in a row, or maybe even 3 times in a row. And I gotta say, this totally sucks. And certainly past Battlefield games have had their share of crappy maps. Battlefield 3 had bad maps, Battlefield 4 had bad maps, Battlefield 1 had crap maps, but at least I could avoid them most of the time. The lack of a server browser and the underpowered matchmaking system is a big problem for me. Even if DICE didn't want to implement a server browser, having a checkbox system where I can uncheck maps that I don't want to play would have been a massive improvement. I'd certainly wait an extra minute to matchmake if it meant I got to pick the map that I wanted to play. I honestly just don't want to play Kaleidoscope or Hourglass anymore. And fixing this doesn't seem like it would be too hard, so maybe it could actually get fixed. Imagine if a game like Counter-Strike didn't let you select your maps. Would people even still be playing it? It's possible they wouldn't. Now, one of the more controversial elements of Battlefield 2042 is the new specialist system replacing traditional classes. It's sort of an attempt to turn Battlefield into a hero shooter game where each specialist gets a super gadget and/or passive ability, and it's certainly not a stylistic choice that helps the game, and in fact, overall it really hurts the world building and immersion. Plus, it does away with the classic class system, which honestly is what differentiated Battlefield from so many other shooters. In my opinion, it's such an unnecessary downgrade that has really gotten the game a ton of bad press. That being said, I actually really like a lot of the super gadgets in the game, and I think that it does elevate Battlefield's somewhat routine shooter gameplay. I'm sure some will disagree, but I have been having an absolute blast playing as Sundance. Sundance's wingsuit is just honestly too much fun for getting flanks on the enemy. I do wish that the maps had more tower opportunities to get elevation so you could use the wingsuit more frequently. I actually don't think the maps were really all that well designed with all the classes in mind. Also, McKay's grappling hook is extremely fun. Getting the height advantage is crazy useful. Pairing him with a sniper rifle or even an SMG to drop down on your enemies, he's an absolute blast to play. Now, of course, not all the specialists are quite as fun or even useful. I rarely play Rao, whose hacking ability seems quite underwhelming, and Dozer's shield, which is actually pretty cool when it works. Well, it often doesn't work out so well, especially on the massive maps with no cover. I can't tell if DICE needs to change the specialists themselves or change the maps so that the specialists can get a little bit more work done. However, the real problem to me with specialists is the actual specialists themselves. They look stupid. They have gimmicky voice lines. There's like 20 identical looking heroes in any given firefight. It feels like I'm playing the Clone Wars or something. The super gadgets could have easily been added to the game without the specialist system, but sadly DICE went the route that they did. Ultimately, I can live with it, but man, would it be nice to be able to replace the specialist models with some of the AI soldier models as an option, or get rid of the voice lines or replace them with less cheesy ones. Now, the lack of the traditional class system has actually been less annoying than I thought it would be. Again, I don't think it's an upgrade for the game, but I am seeing a lot more ammo and medic crates being dropped down. There's plenty of rocket launchers to go around and people placing shields in strategic situations for cover. And DICE just patched in some new UI elements that really help out the teamwork and revive situation. Teamwork was actually suffering quite a bit at launch, and it's clear that DICE is working crazy fast to get some of the left out features back in the game. So if you perhaps played the game during launch and thought the teamwork sucked, it might be worth hopping back on to see how the new UI elements have changed it up. Now, the biggest change changes to the traditional Battlefield formula are the increased player count and the specialist. Both of those changes are, in my opinion, a little undercooked. If the maps get some good cover rework and balance passes, things could flow considerably better, and if the specialists get some personality overhauls and better cosmetics to differentiate themselves more, then I might not even be bothered by the specialist system at all. Now, if you've been browsing social media or Reddit, you've probably seen a ton of complaint lists or missing features with Battlefield 2042, of which are all valid. But to be totally fair to the game, there are also plenty of small upgrades made compared to previous titles. I don't often see them talked about since the missing features generally dictate the online conversation, and of course we will be talking about those missing features as well. But for the new features, I actually really like the improved ribbon system. It's simple, very easy to understand. It's pretty much exploit proof, not allowing you to gain more than a level 3 ribbon in a single match, and they are generalized enough to reward basically all types of gameplay. So no matter how you like to play, you're probably at least working toward one type of ribbon. In addition to that, the progression for weapon unlocks, attachments, and skins is straightforward and no longer bogged down with some of the asinine assignments from previous games. Now the requirements is just get X number of kills with a certain gun or get X number of spots without any sort of time limit or location-based requirement. I think DICE might have actually figured out at least one part of their previously flawed progression system, and I'm happy that I don't have to rage about stuff like get 10 headshots while prone on an objective in one round. I mean, it was totally insane what they made you do in some of the past games. Plus, there's no more equipping assignments to progress them. It all tracks all the time. That being said, the weekly assignments haven't unlocked yet, so I'm not entirely sure how those work out. Now, the new call-in system is actually really cool. It's no longer a squad leader exclusive feature, and you can call in vehicles at any time, and even a robot dog who, let's be honest, is pretty much the star of the show. Anyone can call in at any time. It's just limited by how many vehicles your team has in play currently, so it's basically similar to the normal spawn menu. If there's a free vehicle, you can take it or call one in. It's honestly a great design, and I'd even love to see DICE evolve it with maybe some smoke barrage features and stuff that we got in, say, Battlefield 5. Now, the vehicles themselves are fun, a little buggy and overpowered, but fun nonetheless. The VTOLs feel like something out of a Terminator movie. They command a real presence, hovering over the battle as their gunners just decimate everything around them. The brand new Bolt tank drives like a freaking hot rod and can basically drive over other tanks and do epic jumps. There's definitely some balance work that needs to be done, and a bunch that has already been done, both for and against vehicles. Having 128 players shoot you down in a helicopter can make it seem impossible to fly at times, and at other times you feel like you're absolutely farming the whole server. Rarely do I feel like there's a happy middle ground. It's either you're getting blasted or they're getting blasted. I also really like the concept of DICE's early round deployment system. It's a good idea, just again a little half-baked at this point. Unfortunately, it's already been exploited a little bit and has some buggy spawn issues, but it has stopped entire squads from spawning on a guy who just used the jet to taxi across the map to grab an easy capture point. So it's kind of nice to see a more natural flow onto the map instead of early round cheese. However, DICE didn't really include enough transport vehicles at the start of a round, so there's a lot of running, which feels kind of awkward. And again, people are exploiting it by like crashing jets into the spawn locations, getting like 20 kills at a time. So the system concept is a good idea, it just needs some work. DICE have also been able to disable and enable weapons and gadgets and turn on and off XP without having to patch the game. This is actually a fantastic new feature for them. Even with the speed at which DICE has been deploying patches so far, the ability to immediately react to a bug or exploit has been very welcome, and I hope it remains the standard going forward with the franchise. Any veteran player can probably bring up a whole list of bugs that we had to suffer through for like months at a time before DICE could actually patch them out of the game. This at least gives DICE a pretty good safety net in case something drastic goes wrong in a new update. Also, reviving players and other animation systems are no longer locked into long Battlefield 5-esque sequences, and I gotta say thank God for that. I know some people complain that there wasn't enough animations for entering and exiting vehicles and other things, but ultimately the choice to remove a lot of the locked-in animations has made the game feel like, well, a game again instead of a series of quick-time events, and I'm thankful for it. DICE certainly took a huge risk with Specialist and the increased player count, which could get better or worse depending on how DICE supports the systems, but the underlying fundamentals of the game are still solid. And again, this is actually really important, as not all Battlefield releases had the fundamentals right at the start, and it actually caused a lot of trouble when trying to balance and push things forward. Hopefully, Battlefield 2042 won't have that problem of trying to fix the fundamentals and can instead focus on adding content and just patching bugs and balance issues. Really, the game's main problems are performance, netcode, hit registration issues, disjointed themes, and making sure that their live service content actually delivers what players want. And now, mind you, these are absolutely not minor issues at all. Performance issues have plagued Battlefield games, and sometimes it takes DICE a long time to really get things properly optimized. And again, this is coming from the PC perspective, but currently the game's player count seems to have severely bottlenecked performance, and my high-end GPU appears to be severely underutilized. I've got one of the fastest PC builds that money can buy, and right now the game is usually playing around 80 to 90 FPS on average, with some lows and highs outside of that, but that's also playing on low settings, which is really pretty poor for launch performance. And at a glance, it really seems like most of the optimization was done primarily focusing on next-gen console playability, and the PC side of things feels more like it's a quick port almost. A lot of UI elements feel like they were designed with a console-first mindset, and the mouse latency issues on PC are insanely bad. There's also limited to no joystick support, and DICE didn't even bother putting in separate helicopter and jet controls. These are features that PC has basically always had, and the only reason that they would be gone is if PC took a major backseat to consoles for development. And as a lifetime PC fan of the franchise, this is super disappointing. I hope DICE are able to remedy this situation quickly. Now, netcode wise, there's a ton of seemingly one-frame deaths. It's hard to say if this is more because I'm taking damage from multiple enemies at once, or because the tick rate and packet loss is bad. As far as I know, the official tick rate has not been discovered, though it seems to be capped at 45 Hz, so it could actually be considerably lower than that. There's also well-documented hit registration issues plaguing the game. Obviously, all of this stuff needs to be improved and refined to make the play experience enjoyable. Now, getting into the weeds a little, the missing features or problem things are quite extensive. Someone even put together a list on Reddit of all of the features that past Battlefield games had, which this game does not, and well, to be honest, it's pretty massive. And while it's not to say that each Battlefield game needs to carry over features from the last, it is nice when the good features become staples of the franchise. And Battlefield 2042 feels very much lacking in the quality of life feature department. Some of the sorely needed features were fortunately added in the most recent patch, but it still leaves a lot to be desired. Here's a quick list of things that I'd personally like to see. An in-game scoreboard is top of my list, as is probably for a lot of other players. A personal stats page, maybe one that I can access from a browser as well. A server browser for the base game, or at the very least the ability to uncheck maps that I don't want to play. Having a standard TDM quick match option separate from Portal, just like on the main menu, would be great. A quick, easy to access shooting range that's separate from the Portal or bot mode, just making it easy to get in and test out guns or vehicles. Creating a pilot class that comes with a repair tool and sidearm that you get when spawning with a vehicle. It's so hard to try and switch over to a repair tool quickly before getting into a vehicle. It almost never happens. It would also be nice if DICE made a way for people in groups larger than 4 to be able to play on the same team and same server, especially since games are 128 players now. having more friends join a single side or a single team seems like a good feature. DICE also needs to inject a lot more quad bikes and basic transports around the map, especially in the spawn locations. And finally, I think DICE really needs to add in an option for people to be able to pay for a dedicated Portal server. It's clear that DICE's servers are set up to support dedicated server systems, and they already own all the servers, so why not implement some sort of pay for dedicated server system? It's sort of a win-win, and I think the current system is going to make community building next to impossible without any sort of dedication. Now, I'm not actually going to add single player to my list of features that I think DICE should have added. In case you didn't know, Battlefield 2042 is one of the first Battlefield games in a while to not ship with a campaign or a single player mode. This doesn't bother me at all. I've never really enjoyed the previous ones. I didn't even finish half of the previous ones unless they were required to get certain in-game unlocks for multiplayer. So basically it doesn't bother me, but I'd understand if this was something that you guys enjoyed from the past games. Now, of course, there's also the issue of only having 22 base game guns. There are, of course, way more weapons in the full game if you count the portal modes, but I'm finding that I spend less time switching between the modes right now, and I'm just preferring the base game overall. So for 90% of my gaming, I only have access to 22 guns, and that's including the sidearms. And I've seen the comparisons to, say, like Battlefield 4, where there was just a massive amount of guns when the game first released. To be totally fair and to compare to all the different games out there, Battlefield 1 shipped with only 24 primary weapons at launch, but it would still be really nice to get some new guns injected soon, as the variety is definitely starting to wear thin a bit. This is really going to come down to DICE's live service support and how quickly they can get new guns in the game to keep players entertained. Now, there's actually two elements of this game that were marketed pre-release to generate some hype that I think have ended up being total letdowns. The first are tornadoes. I don't think anyone even pays attention to them anymore. I don't think I've actually died to one, maybe even once. You practically have to walk into them to get killed by them, and for the most part, they really just serve as an annoying distraction to actually having a fun firefight. I think if DICE sped up their movement speed and maybe increased the range at which you would get sucked into them and or killed, and maybe even let them rip apart helicopters and better destroy buildings and the environment, they just don't really do much of that stuff, and the trailer made them look like they would do a lot more. They could definitely use some work, because that trailer is super misleading if you were expecting to be thrown around by tornadoes during your matches. The second feature that was actually teased extremely early, before 2042 was even officially announced, was an extremely high fidelity destruction system. They showed an entire skyscraper-sized building being leveled to the ground in a very dynamic looking way, like way beyond what you could do in Battlefield 4 with Levolution. And not only is this not possible to do in 2042, but the destruction is clearly toned down compared to past Battlefield games, making the world feel a bit more static than I was expecting it to. Now, of course, the narrative is that bumping the player count up to 128 required sacrificing other features due to the CPU requirements, but if you asked me at the start if I wanted to have super high fidelity destruction or 128 players, I probably would have gone with the destruction route. The truth is that Battlefield doesn't need 128 players to be good or exciting, and higher destruction fidelity probably would have made for a much better game. But alas, DICE has gone the direction that they've gone, and I'm hoping that they can further tweak the game to take full advantage of having 128 player servers. Now, what about Portal, the mode that got even more hype than the base game itself? It's hard to mention 2042's base game without at least addressing its other two modes, Portal and Hazard Zone, and as far as I'm concerned, Portal is still sort of a wait-and-see mode at the moment. DICE had to turn off Portal XP to prevent XP farming, so it might be of more interest when I'm less concerned about ranking up and unlocking attachments. It does in fact appear to be extremely powerful. We've already seen some impressive stuff with it, like a wingsuit trainer, and DICE does intend to to continue adding tools to increase its power. However, unless they allow people to make dedicated Portal servers, I don't think it's ever going to reach its full potential. People have already figured out how to make Battle Royales, Gunmaster, and Infection modes, and I gotta say they are fun distractions, but not exactly enough to pull me away from the base game regularly. I'd really love to see some community servers pop up that experiment with stuff like 64-player Rush on 2042 maps and 64-player versions of the base game to test out smaller player counts. And while those servers can be found if you're lucky, again, not having a dedicated server option makes it really hard to build a community and have favorited servers. It was such a big part of Battlefield 4, and I really don't know why DICE wouldn't want people to have that as an option. Plus, they do have to figure out a way to get XP back into Portal for at least some of the modes. I really don't know what DICE's plan is going forward with that. And then of course there's Hazard Zone, the third game mode. And I know this is supposed to be a full in-depth review, but I gotta say I think my first impressions video more or less covered my thoughts on this mode. It's an extraction royale that feels poorly tested and frankly unimaginative. It's heavily reliant on pretty basic bots and has an economy with very little risk and reward benefits. I'm not really sure who this mode is made for, as it's nowhere near challenging enough to attract the serious players, and it honestly has a really boring gameplay loop compared to other extraction royales. The only way I see this mode maintaining a player base is if DICE does a complete overhaul and then re-releases it for free. This mode is kind of a bummer, but not totally unexpected since Royale-style games were clearly never DICE's passion. Now moving on to the story of Battlefield 2042, it feels very Tom Clancy-esque. Unfortunately, the short film trailer doesn't do the best job of explaining the world and circumstances. It was confusing as to who was fighting who and why no Pats were fighting instead of the US and Russia. It was all a bit vague. The secret satellite weapon seems like a cool plot point, but again, the narrative is still kind of hidden, so it feels weird about having a whole game fighting about something that, again, we don't really know what it is. I guess we're fighting to try and keep the satellite information secret, and some people are trying to fight to get that satellite info. That part of it is pretty confusing. That being said, the world portrayed via the trailer and other promotional material actually looked pretty cool. I was expecting flooded, destroyed cities, and dystopian environments. But unfortunately, the actual game feels barren and lacking any connection to the world that we're supposedly fighting for. The maps lack detail and visual styling that reflect a world that's on the brink of economic collapse and suffering mass starvation. Everything seems kind of clean. Even Battlefield 4 dirtied up their maps appropriately. In 2042, when playing the Kaleidoscope map, which is Seoul, South Korea, the city is immaculate and not at all reflective of the world. I mean, some of the skyscrapers should be in ruins. There should be shanty towns or makeshift dwellings in the streets, fires in the distance, things that make the world look like the dystopian future we're supposed to be in, not a pristine utopia. There's a huge disconnect between the art direction and the backstory. It's sort of like they picked the locations, started making the maps, and then wrote the backstory later and forgot to tell the level designers to make the world feel apocalyptic. It's actually a huge letdown considering just how awesome apocalyptic locations can look in video games, plus DICE has a pretty damn good art team in which they could have done it. The only map that even gets close to attempting some sort of dystopian future is Hourglass, and the half-submerged stadium is one of the few areas that even reminds you of a world overtaken by the environment. The base of the skyscrapers do a little more, but that's really about it. Plus, it makes no sense that tornadoes are constantly ravaging the world and yet everything still looks pretty good. And to be honest, I've never played a Battlefield game that feels this disjointed overall. The specialists all look goofy. Few of them even wear helmets and their voice lines are super cartoony. The complete opposite of what the Exodus trailer portrayed. It would be totally immersion breaking if DICE had even immersed me in the first place. People have pointed out many times now that the AI in the game actually look much cooler than the specialist, and they actually take more styling cues from their factions. It's actually a real disappointment that those weren't the characters we got to play as instead of these weird cartoony specialists. And in fact, aside from jets, attack helicopters, transport helis, and tanks, well, there's basically nothing setting the factions apart visually. And while you could argue that it solves the problem where previous Battlefield games had one faction with uniforms that would usually blend into the environment better than the other faction, it's still a massive downgrade overall in the world crafting aspect. So to summarize this part of the review, it's some of DICE's worst world crafting yet, which is a huge disappointment since it's usually a big highlight for the franchise. Now from here, it makes sense to go into more depth with the map design. In my opinion, the map design in the Battlefield franchise has been going downhill since Battlefield 3. It was explained to me by a developer some time ago that the transition from Battlefield 3 to Battlefield 4 saw a change in the approach to level design, where before a level designer would conceptualize the flow and layout of a map and then an artist would come in and kind of build it out to make it look pretty. However, with Battlefield 4, apparently it went the other way, where the artist would design the foundation of the map and then the designer would come in and try and make it playable. I don't know if this is still the case, but it absolutely seems like it with 2042. Of these 7 base game maps, there's already 2 that I would rather never play again, which of course I can't avoid because of the matchmaking system and lack of server browser. Those 2 maps are Hourglass and Kaleidoscope. They're massive, flat, and completely lack cover in most of the areas. Also, both of them end their breakthrough modes on top of skyscrapers, in which capturing the objective is next to impossible. I've done it once in my entire time playing the game, and I mostly was playing breakthrough. It begs the question, did DICE even test these maps with 128 real players to see if it was possible? Now, despite the overall downgrade in map design and maps feeling more like studies in location rendering and lighting than actual level design, I do enjoy some of the maps quite a bit. Breakaway, Discarded, and Manifest are honestly some pretty good fun. Granted, each of the maps has its own problems, but when you're at a fun location and really stuck in a good firefight, the maps tend to kick ass. Breakaway has some of the most epic wingsuit moments in the game, allowing you to fly more or less across the entire map. It has epic clifftop sniping battles, a frozen lake with glacial firefights, and a giant oil derrick that could practically be a map within itself. Discarded has awesome oil tanker fights and zipline galore. The oil tankers compartmentalize the 128 player combat into something much more digestible and offers room clearing or sniping opportunities. Now, Manifest is the infantry map. It's not to say a helicopter pilot won't ruin your day from time to time, but the massive shipping yard is like No Shar Canals on steroids. There's tons of lanes and compartmentalized firefights. There's also tons of awesome opportunities for snipers up on top of cranes and McKay grappling up to the top of container vantage points. It even has a mini jungle around its mountaintop objective points, which can be a really fun place to fight through when playing on Breakthrough. Now, Renewal and Orbital are passable maps, but both of them suffer from DICE's allergy to cover. I mean, I thought Battlefield 4 had cover problems, but this game is like, cover? What's that? As if the developers just thought Irish's deployable shield would somehow allow teams to effectively push across massive open fields. And Orbital is a really pretty map, and I like a lot of things about the map, but the layout just creates too many long distance, no cover situations. Players flock to the fun combat spots, and the objectives on the outskirts seem to be mostly ignored due to travel time or lack of cover along the way. And Renewal is a similar situation. It can be really fun if you're a sniper, but the map needs to have engagement ranges for all weapon types, and Renewal is just flat for most of it. And there's no map compartmentalization, so while you might think you're having a 1v1 firefight with a guy in some rock outcropping, there's actually like 5 other people looking at you from weird angles, and you can't do anything about it. And this leads me to a much bigger problem with the game. DICE bumped the player count up to 128 players. This is something that has been controversial since the game's release because it feels like many other aspects of the game were traded out for the increased player count. And while I personally think 128 players can be a good thing, it does require that DICE learn how to design some freaking maps. Compartmentalization. Say it with me, you so-called level designers. You cannot double the player count on a map and expect it to play well if you don't break the map up into sections that can exist with their own pockets of combat. The most rudimentary understanding of this problem would just be interpreted as a lack of cover, but a deeper explanation is really sectioning the maps out so that one section cannot interfere with the other section. If I'm in a firefight with somebody, I don't want it to end with me winning only to immediately get sniped by somebody 100 to 200 meters away that I didn't know anything about. Sure, it's fine from time to time, but so much of the combat in this game is me in a close quarter firefight ultimately getting killed by somebody super far away because there's no compartmentalization of the maps. In a strategic shooter, you want to be able to control your combat environment. You want to be able to whittle your angles of exposure down to as few as possible and then control those angles. That's not possible in 90% of the map locations. And it's so frustrating because this is actually an avoidable problem and it's really not that hard to make maps work. Anyone remember the PlayStation exclusive game MAG, aka Massive Action Game? It touted 256 players per server and it did it by compartmentalizing the action. Now I only played the game a few times at my friend's house, but if you actually go and look at some of the game design, the combat and sight lines are laned out and compartmentalized. I don't know why DICE chooses to make their maps look like hyper-realistic locations before thinking about how the gameplay might actually flow. I mean, just take a second to look at old Battlefield maps like Grand Bazaar, Talal Market, Sharkey Peninsula, Marquez Monolith. These maps are laned out with intentional and well-designed combat zones. When you design wide open maps where you're just like, well, I guess people will fight around these areas, so let's just put down a few rocks and see what happens, well then you get crappy cover and less tactical gameplay. And I know I'm kind of ranting on this issue for a while, but I have been pointing out this specific issue since Battlefield 4's map problems began. And again, DICE seem to just think traditional map design doesn't apply to them for some reason, even though the traditional design techniques worked incredibly well with a lot of Battlefield 3 maps. Now, honestly, I can see a lot of ways to fix some of the more problematic areas in the 2042 maps. DICE can do it, they just have to realize what the problems are and how to fix them. They did mention that map updates were something they wanted to do in patches, so maybe they will. It's not something that they've really done much of in the past though. Mostly they just fix exploits and broken things, so we'll have to see what happens in the long run. Alright, I've been rambling for way too long. It's time to frickin' wrap things up. Battlefield 2042 is simply not the best Battlefield game ever released. It's not the worst ever released, and it's not to say it won't become the best Battlefield game over time, but it does have a long way to go before getting there. All of its problems are fixable, and frankly, DICE is fixing the game at a faster rate than I've ever seen before, so maybe that's indicative of a good future for the title. It's incredibly hard to tell since, as mentioned with Battlefield 5, these games usually go through massive transformations from their release to their final DLC. There's no way I can possibly tell you what this game is going to be like in a year from now, but I can say I think it's actually going to be pretty fantastic. At this moment in time, the game is still quite a bit of fun, and it injects plenty of sandbox, only in Battlefield moments and solid gunplay. It's certainly not the most fun launch experience I've had. That award probably goes to Battlefield 3 or Battlefield 1, and it's also not a refined, bug-free experience. And if that's going to bother you a lot, then you probably won't enjoy this game right off the bat. You may want to give the devs a little bit more time to do some more patching. Thematically, the game is weaker than most Battlefield releases, and that does suck. It actually bothers me a lot more than I thought it would. It's possible DICE could do some map overhauls to improve that, but I honestly doubt that that's going to happen. From here on out, patching, DLC, and the Portal experience are really going to dictate how this game holds up. It does have massive potential, especially with a properly supported Portal system. The building blocks are there, and the base game is just waiting to be loaded up with more content. So if DICE delivers from here on out, we could be in for an awesome ride. The question is, do you want to hop on board now or wait to see where the train is going? That I leave up to you. For me though, I'm gonna hop back in and see if I can fly Sundance onto an enemy transport VTOL and blow it up with some C5, because, well, you can do that now. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you stuck through to the end of the video, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.